Walk into any hardware store in the country and count the herbicide products on the shelf. You'll find dozens: pre-emergent granules, post-emergent concentrates, brush killers, broad-spectrum sprays, products for lawns, and products for driveways, and products for flower beds. Now, consider this. The people who grow the actual food in this country, the ones managing acres of vegetables and grain and row crops year after year, almost none of them shop that aisle, not because they've taken some principled stand, not because they can't afford it, because they don't need it, and they never did. My name is Walter, and I've been farming reclaimed industrial ground for going on 20 years using methods I pulled out of county extension bulletins that were printed before most of that hardware store shelf existed. I learned weed management the same way I learned everything else on this land, through old agronomy manuals, field journals, and a lot of quiet observation of what the soil was actually telling me. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the 5 methods that working farmers have always used to manage weed pressure without a single purchased herbicide. And by the time we're done, you'll have enough to start applying at least one of them before the end of this season. A farmer in the dryland grain country of the Central Plains, sometime in the early 1950s, is walking his field margins in late March with a small notebook in his breast pocket. He's not alarmed by what he sees. There are weeds coming up, common chickweed along the low edge, a scatter of wild mustard on the north end, and he is writing them down, not reaching for anything. He's counting. He's been doing this for 30 years, and he knows something that doesn't appear anywhere on a product label. Not all weed pressure requires action. Below a certain plant density, weeds do not meaningfully reduce yield. The crop shades them out, outcompetes them for moisture, and the harvest comes in just fine. The decision this farmer is making, the first decision before any method is chosen, is whether the population he's looking at actually crosses the threshold that warrants any intervention at all. This is called weed scouting, and it was standard practice before the herbicide era turned every green thing in a field into a problem requiring a solution you could purchase. USDA Cooperative Extension Weed Threshold publications, available through land-grant university archives, documented this approach extensively through the mid-20th century. The threshold varies by crop, by weed species, by growth stage, and by your soil's water-holding capacity. But the principle is constant. You look first. You count. You decide whether the population is actually competitive. A significant percentage of the time, the answer is no. The retail herbicide market does not benefit from you knowing this. If you understand thresholds, you might walk your garden, look at what's coming up, and decide to do nothing. That is not a transaction. That is the first thing a farmer does, and it is the thing most completely absent from any product instruction you've ever read. This week, before you pull or spray anything, walk your plot and count what's there. Look up whether that weed species, at that density, actually competes with your intended crop. That one step changes everything that comes after it. Next, I want to show you a method that works before your crop ever goes in the ground, and it turns the weed seed bank against itself. A truck crop farmer in the mid-Atlantic sometime in the mid-1940s has tilled his transplant beds 2 full weeks before he plans to set a single seedling. His neighbor thinks he's gotten ahead of himself. He hasn't. He's running a trap. The surface is loose, the soil is warm, and he's waiting for the first flush of weed seeds in that top half-inch of ground to do what weed seeds do when conditions are right: germinate. When they do, when that first thin mat of seedlings appears across the bed surface, he comes back through with a stirrup hoe barely an inch deep and kills every one of them before they've had time to root. Then he plants. This is the stale seedbed technique, and it's documented in USDA market gardening bulletins from the 1920s through the 1940s. The principle behind it is straightforward. Most of the annual weed species that cause trouble in vegetable beds germinate from the top half-inch of soil. Till that layer, wait for germination, kill the seedlings at the surface, and you've drawn down the seed bank before your crop competes with it. The crop goes into ground that has already spent its first flush of weed pressure. The difference in early season weed load is significant, and it costs nothing but timing. A bag of pre-emergent granules to cover a mid-sized garden bed runs anywhere from $15 to $30 and needs to be reapplied each season. The stale seed bed costs you 10 extra days and one pass with a hoe. That is the full comparison. Before your next planting, till your bed, wait 10 days, watch what germinates, run a hoe through the surface no deeper than an inch, and plant the following day. Do that once, and you'll understand why it was standard instruction for 2 generations of market gardeners. There's another method in this toolkit, one that works at the rotation level rather than the bed level, and it's where the picture starts to get bigger. A farmer somewhere in the upper South, probably the late 1930s, has a field of cereal rye standing through early spring that his neighbor keeps asking him about. When is he going to work it in? He's not behind. He's waiting for the residue to do something specific. Cereal rye, when it's terminated and left on the soil surface, releases compounds from its decomposing tissue that suppress the germination of a wide range of annual weed seeds. This is allelopathy, a chemical relationship between plant residue and the weed seed bank, and it was understood by farmers managing rotations without chemical inputs long before it was named and studied in agronomy journals. The practical knowledge here is specific. Cereal rye carries the strongest allelopathic effect of the commonly used cover crops, followed by sorghum Sudan hybrids and buckwheat in certain conditions. The residue needs to remain on the surface, not incorporated, to suppress weeds through the following planting window. And the cash crop that follows matters. Some crops tolerate establishment through allelopathic residue better than others, and that matching is something you need to look up for your specific situation before you plant. This knowledge didn't disappear because it stopped working. It was replaced by recommendations for pre-emergent herbicide applications because those require a purchase and a cover crop rotation requires planning and patience. Someone profits when you don't know the difference. Look up which cover crops carry allelopathic properties suited to your region and your intended cash crop. Plant one this fall. The suppression effect shows up the following season, and it builds from there. Now I want to shift gears because what comes next is the kind of thing that sounds almost too simple. But the timing element here is something almost no one outside of production farming has ever been told. A vegetable farmer in the 1950s is running his cultivating tractor down his rows, and he's doing it at early afternoon on a dry, clear day. Not in the morning when most field work happens, not on a cloudy day when the air is cool. His hired hand has asked him about this more than once. The farmer's answer is the same every time. The sun does the work. When you cultivate in cool, moist morning conditions, you uproot weed seedlings and leave them sitting on soil that has enough moisture and low enough temperature to let a percentage of them reroot. Come back 2 days later and some of those seedlings are still alive. Cultivate at peak solar and thermal conditions, early afternoon, low humidity, direct sun, and uprooted seedlings desiccate on the surface within hours. The kill rate is not the same. It is dramatically different. This was documented in pre-herbicide tillage research through USDA and state extension experiment stations, and it translates directly to a stirrup hoe in your garden. The depth matters too, no deeper than an inch, because you're targeting surface germinating annuals, and deeper cultivation just brings up a new layer of weed seeds. The timing and the depth together turn cultivation from a partial measure into something close to complete. A bottle of post-emergent contact herbicide for a garden plot runs $10 to $20 per application. Cultivating at the right time on a dry afternoon with a $12 stirrup hoe costs you nothing beyond the first tool purchase. Next dry, sunny afternoon you have, go out afternoon, go shallow, and check your results in 48 hours. Now, we've arrived at the piece that ties everything together. And this one operates at a level most gardeners and small-scale growers never reach. A county extension agent in the mid-1940s is sitting across a table from a new landowner at a farm bureau meeting, and he's sliding a hand-drawn rotation chart across the table. He tells the man that the point of the rotation isn't yield. The yield is a consequence. The point is sequence. Different crops, planted in deliberate order, disrupt the reproductive cycles of the weed populations that would dominate a field if you grew the same thing in the same ground year after year. Narrow-leafed crops suppress broadleaf weeds, broadleaf crops suppress grass weeds. Deep-rooted crops break the surface disturbance patterns that favor shallow germinating annuals. A farmer running a sound 3-year rotation is not in an ongoing fight with his weed population. He has designed the system so those populations cannot establish. This was standard instruction in farm management curricula before the herbicide era, documented extensively in crop rotation and integrated weed management literature through the 1950s. It is the most complete of the 5 methods because it doesn't address a weed problem after it exists. It designs the conditions under which certain weed species cannot thrive. Monoculture agriculture, which became dominant with the commodity grain system, maximizes weed pressure almost by definition, and maximum weed pressure requires maximum herbicide input. The relationship between those two outcomes was not accidental. Sketch a 3-year rotation for your plot on paper. Right now, if you want. Alternate a grass-type crop with a broadleaf crop. Note which weeds you have this season and research which rotation crops suppress them. That's where this starts. Here is what a farmer who knows all 5 of these things looks like in practice. He walks his ground in early spring before he does anything else, notebook in hand, counting and identifying rather than reaching for a product. He decides whether the pressure he's seeing is actually above the threshold that requires intervention. If he's about to plant, he may have already run a stale seedbed cycle, tilled 2 weeks early, let the first flush of weeds germinate, killed them at the surface, and planted into relatively clean ground. His cover crop from last fall may still be contributing allelopathic suppression through its surface residue. When he does cultivate, he waits for the right conditions. Dry air, afternoon sun, shallow depth. And underneath all of it, his rotation is doing the long work, disrupting the weed seed bank at the system level so that pressure decreases year over year rather than compounding. None of this required a hardware store. None of it required a product label. All of it is documented in public agricultural records, extension bulletins, agronomy journals, experiment station publications, sitting in land-grant university archives, available to anyone who looks. This knowledge wasn't lost in some agricultural collapse. It was quietly set aside when a market emerged that found it more profitable for you not to have it. The people who wrote it down were working farmers and extension agents who understood that weed management was a craft, not a purchase, and they left the record intact. You just weren't pointed toward it. Before you buy anything for weed control this season, walk the ground first. Count what's there. Decide whether you're actually above the threshold that requires action. That one step alone will likely change what you do next, and the other 4 methods will build from there on their own logic. Next time, we're going to talk about soil fertility. Specifically, one amendment that was standard practice on commercial grain operations for decades, costs almost nothing, and is still completely available to you. I'll tell you what category it falls in. You'll have to come back to find out exactly what it is.